Hello. So welcome to part 2 of week 14. In this lecture, we're going to investigate the history of the Environmental Protection Agency. This is a fascinating history, and there are pieces here you might be able to use in your teaching. Even if you don't use them, having an understanding of the history of the institution that manages our environment at a federal level is really important. And everything that is set out at the federal level gets effectively delegated to state agencies to police. It is complicated. As I mentioned before, there is a lot of fine print, and I want to try and make it as simple as possible, yet give you a general understanding of how it works. So that said, let's dive in. Where's, just bear with me. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the first thing you may notice is right here. Why have I got Great Lakes Brewing Company Burning River beer up here? We'll get to see that shortly. So big question, first of all, is how did the EPA come into existence? Or maybe you could phrase that, why does environmental policy exist? And really, there's two main drivers here. There's a whole bunch of natural processes that we try to manage or mitigate. And I've listed those here. But then there are a bunch of human-caused events that it tries to prevent, that we try to manage. And those are listed in here. Now, when it comes down to a summary of what the EPA is responsible for, first of all, there are 5 main acts, which are also called policies. And then there are what we call land use designations. And effectively, this is what lays out what activities are allowed or disallowed on certain tracts of land. And then comes the sort of the nitty gritty, the actual environmental regulations. So this is the setting of the standards. So this is about the standards for air quality, water quality, and soil quality. And then the real nitty gritty, the actual permitting and enforcement, which usually flows down to states to manage in a way that is complex. So I mentioned there are 5 key acts or policies, 1 through 5 here. And this is kind of a alphabet soup of policies. What we're going to think about is, in particular, the Clean Water Act. You've looked at surface water and groundwater. So effectively, the Clean Water Act is about having water that is fishable and drinkable. The Clean Air Act, the CAA, is about having air that is breathable. And then the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, we'll look at. And then there's the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, with CERCLA being the acronym, but this gets reduced to being called Superfund. And I'm sure you have heard at some point about Superfund sites. These are contaminated sites that get managed by the EPA. So the history of environmental policy is fascinating. The EPA has a really good timeline, and there are a couple of excellent video links here. But essentially, this is where we come back to the Burning Lake beer. There were a series of events that took place from the 50s through into the 60s that really spurred public action. The Cuyahoga River burning, an area called Love Canal, then Times Beach and Valley of the Drums. We're going to look at Cuyahoga River and Love Canal. You can Google Times Beach and Valley of the Drums. And the story of contamination in Woburn, Massachusetts was written up in a book called A Civil Action and then turned into a movie. It's really worth watching the movie to get a sense of just how these situations can work. So first of all, let's take a look at Cleveland or the Cuyahoga River. So there is a couple of really good links here. But what you can see over on the lower right here is an image of downtown Cleveland and the Cuyahoga River in the 60s. And if you move over to the map on the left, here we have Cleveland and Lake Erie. And this river was incredibly contaminated. Now, as we look considered in surface and groundwater, one can't always tell that a river is contaminated. It can carry contaminants as dissolved materials and appear clear, but still be contaminated. When you look at the river here, there is clearly an issue. Now, there were a whole series of fires, and that's because there was a lot of oil and other material effectively floating on the water. And there were a series of fires, and there's also an interesting story here about how journalists misused images from earlier fires. But the short story is, yes, the river caught fire because of all the contaminants. The longer story is that the cleanup that was done as a consequence of all the mandates that were eventually put into place by the EPA mean that the Cuyahoga River and its entire watershed are now fish can live in them, and the water is largely uncontaminated. So the second story is Love Canal. So let's just take a look at a map to show where this is. It's in the Niagara Falls area. So here we have Lake Erie and Niagara Falls and Lake Ontario. And back in the 1890s, there was an investor, developer by the name of William T. Love, and he wanted to build a model city. So here is Lake Ontario, and here is the overall site for the model city. And the area that he started to develop was right in here. So what did he do? I should mention there's a book about the story of Love Canal. So in 1894, started excavations at the southern end. But there was financial failure in 1896. And so the project was kind of abandoned, but this whole sort of area had been excavated. And so in the 1920s, it effectively became a dump site for the city of Niagara. So this was in the era when no one was thinking about the connection between what got dumped in a depression and its impact on groundwater or anything else. Well, this area was bought by the Hooker Chemical Company. And here you see it identified as a canal. That's because during development as a dump, it was basically further excavated as an elongate canal-like feature. So the Hooker Chemical Company converted it to a landfill, and more than 21,000 tons of chemicals were dumped there. And then in 1952 through 1953, the land was transferred to the Niagara Falls School Board. So in the meantime, there were houses. Well, after this, housing was built in the area. And so let's take a look here. Here we've got two images, and what you can see is prior to housing development, and then here we have housing development in that area of what got called Love Canal, where a large amount of toxic material had been dumped. So I don't want to show the actual videos, but watch these videos. The story of the what was happening in all the houses here is just tragic. There was chemical ooze coming up from the ground. There were incredibly high incidences of cancer, and effectively nothing was done about it until there were a group of citizens that started to take action and protest. So it's really worth watching these videos. And one thing I do want to say is after they cleaned up this area, there were issues because where do you put toxic waste? The place that they took some of that toxic waste has then produced some further problems. You can see those arose in 2016, and it's never that far from being a news story. So what do they actually do, or what did they do? So I want you, here we have the land surface, and what it's capturing here is where there were some basements in houses. There were toxic materials leaking into basements. Right here is the original depth of Love Canal. And as you can tell, they're not really certain about some of the details. But what is important is what they've tried to do now to fill it, remove material and fill it up. So they have extracted the majority of material, and they have filled it up, and they put a clay cap on it. They've installed a drainage system to capture that toxic leachate. And so that will be pumped out in there. There are clays in above the material here. And then what you'll notice is it goes down through glacial sediment into a dolomite. So that's what it looks like now. And this actually is a simplified version of that diagram. So some of the houses were demolished and removed. Others were deemed relatively safe, and I don't know what the criteria were. If we look at a map of the area, this captures that central area where the canal with all the toxic material was in. So between the Cuyahoga River and the Love Canal, which garnered presidential attention and visits because it was just so unconscionable. This is what led to all of these policies being enacted. What we're going to take a brief look at is RCRA and then the Superfund. So first of all, RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And this involves all sorts of rules and regulations that effectively center on generation, storage, transport of solid and hazardous waste. And it has at its core protecting humans and the environment and conserving energy and natural resources. Also embedded in this is the reduction of the amount of waste. So it's all about the rules and regulations around waste. We can think of it as resource conservation. And caught up in this, or as a consequence of this, some of you may remember back in the 1980s, there was this shipload of garbage that effectively sailed from Long Island, but had nowhere to go. Nowhere would accept it because of its toxicity. And it ended up spending a very long time at sea because it had nowhere that it could go to legally dispose of the material it was carrying. There are some really interesting stories about this in these links. So finally, we get to the Superfund, or CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act. And effectively, this authorizes the government to respond to release of hazardous substances from closed or abandoned, and this should say landfills right here. So often material was either disposed of illegally, or there is a landfill that was closed, but then identified as containing hazardous materials. So this has lots of fine print, and effectively that provides ways to allocate liability for what has been left there. Now, how does the funding for this work effectively? This law or policy established a trust fund, and the funds to support that mostly come from a variety of taxes associated with petroleum and chemical industries. And they cover the cost of cleanup in situations where it is hard or impossible to identify a responsible party. So there are many Superfund sites. Well, you can go to one of the links that I'm going to give you to find Superfund sites in Minnesota. And some of them have identified responsible parties. Others are being cleaned up with use of this Superfund money. So how do they actually identify these Superfund sites? So they have a ranking system, and that ranking system looks at, well, will a site release hazardous or toxic materials? And then will people or sensitive environments be affected? And then it goes on to, if that is the case, it goes on to a national priority list. And the Superfund focuses on cleaning up those sites that are on the national priority list. And there are currently more than 1,200 sites on that priority list. And this is where it gets very complicated because there's potentially responsible parties that could be liable for the cleanup cost. So let's just look at these sites, and this is not this year's data here, but I want you to take a look at Minnesota here. You can identify there are some of these red dots. There are some potentially impacted sites. So those would be sites that are on the national priority list. So one of the things you may be wondering now is, oh, where are they? What are they? So these are the places to go to find out if there's a Superfund site near you. There's the EPA Superfund website, and then there's the EPA interactive map. And that's where I got this image for or from. There's also a really good link through the Pollution Control Agency in Minnesota that looks at Superfund sites in Minnesota. You can do various searches to find Superfund sites that may or may not be located near you. So with that, that is our really brief tour through the Environmental Protection Agency and some of its history and links to all the information about the potential or NPL Superfund sites. Okay, so enjoy investigating these. I'll see you next week.